Hi, Nino. It's good to see you again, and thank you for coming back to talk about more developments in this very closely watched trial.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Nino, Erin Patterson has been on the stand all week. Cross-examination continues next week, but we're speaking to you on Friday morning. Before we go into her evidence, can you just take us through that moment when you first heard Erin Patterson would give evidence? What was it like?
Look, it was quite an extraordinary moment. We were obviously in the 6th week of this trial when it happened, and we knew the prosecution case had closed, and we knew sort of from the start of the case that once that happened, that's when the defence would get a chance to call witnesses if they had any. But I think the thing that probably made it sort of go from something that was all quite extraordinary and that we all sort of, everybody in the court seemed quite surprised and amazed by, was that after that announcement was made, there was then a 15-minute break. So it was kind of, it could have been anticlimactic, but almost the opposite happened. Everybody kind of, the anticipation built, I suppose, a little bit from that moment when her lawyer, Colin Mandy, sort of said, we're going to call Erin Patterson, to the moment where she actually stood in the witness box and started to speak for the first time in this trial.
So it unfolded quite quickly by the sounds of it, and she was going to have the chance to tell her side of the story. But before we go on, can you just remind us about the case against her and her defence in this trial?
Erin Patterson's been accused of murdering her in-laws, Don and Gail Patterson. She's also accused of murdering Gail's sister, Heather Wilkinson, and the attempted murder of Ian Wilkinson, who's Heather's husband. Now, she's pleaded not guilty to all those charges, and she says the poisoning was a tragic accident. Effectively, up until this moment, the prosecution are saying that she deliberately put death cap mushrooms into beef Wellingtons that she served her lunch guests. Her defence are saying it was a tragic accident. The defence obviously able to cross-examine all the prosecution witnesses. There were more than 50 of those, and sort of chip away at what they think are some of the weak points in that evidence. But in order for Erin Patterson to, I suppose, counteract that prosecution claim around her intent when she fed those beef Wellingtons to her guests, she needs to be able to get up and tell her side of the story, and that's what we started to see this week.
So Erin Patterson begins her evidence. Can you set the scene for us as she takes the stand?
Yeah, so look, it's a fairly small, modern courtroom. There's about 40 seats in that court and a sort of separate bench seat off to the side, and there wasn't anywhere spare in that entire room to sit. There's about a dozen seats sort of reserved for the Patterson and Wilkinson families. There's some seats for the police and including the informant in the case, the detectives in charge of the entire homicide investigation. There's about 6 seats reserved for the media, and then the rest, it was just public piled in, and this was on the first day, so this was on Monday. And by the next day, and as we'd been reporting that Erin Patterson was giving evidence, there was actually queues sort of standing up outside, from about 7 in the morning to sort of start, trying to get in and get one of those sort of roughly 20 seats that were available to the public. So Erin Patterson gets up. She, as every witness does, has to say her full name, has to say her age. She actually sort of had to almost think for a little bit and said 50, as if it had come as a surprise to her that she'd reached that milestone. And then she started to talk, sort of going all the way back, so starting with her relationship to Simon and then gradually moving over the days towards the lunch in question.
We will come to that, but give us a sense of what she's like on the stand.
I think it's difficult to sort of, surmise 5 days almost worth of evidence in kind of a pithy sort of statement. But I guess she has appeared thoughtful at times. She's appeared emotional quite often when talking about her children or talking about her lunch guests. You'd have to say she seems quite honest about admitting the lies that the defence have said she's told in the case. Some of those lies they mentioned right back at the start of this trial in their opening address, but she's sort of been taken to them on probably dozens of occasions now, mostly by her own lawyers, but also in cross-examination. She will sometimes ask for questions to be repeated. She has a habit of sort of moving her head almost before her mouth starts moving. Sometimes she'll seem to sort of cock her head as if she's trying to think of how best to respond. Other times she'll sort of start shaking her head. Sometimes she'll do that when she's actually getting quite upset and getting quite emotional. She'll start to shake her head and before almost, welling up and having to sort of take a deep breath and then answering something that she's seemingly finding quite difficult to answer. So it's certainly been a compelling 5 days in court.
Let's go to some of the evidence that she's given so far. At one point, Erin Patterson was asked about foraging for mushrooms, and a picture started to emerge about this habit that she'd developed.
Yeah, so we've heard evidence already during this trial that foraging was something that had become increasingly popular in Victoria during the sort of COVID lockdown periods of 2020. And Erin said that's when it became popular for her as well, that basically she had, as people from Victoria will no doubt remember from that time, there were certain lockdowns when they only had an hour outside each day. Erin Patterson said that for her hour, she used to like taking her children for walks in sort of local gardens and on local rail trails, and she noticed mushrooms growing then. And she says basically that over time a bit of a habit developed. She also noticed mushrooms growing in her own property. She had about 3 acres at the time. She then moved to another 3-acre property later on where the lunch was held. But basically she started picking mushrooms occasionally, tearing a little bit off, frying it up, cooking it, seeing what it was like. When they were safe, she said that she ended up actually chopping them up and dehydrating them, and in some cases actually, hiding them in food for her children to improve the amount of vegetables that they were eating. So she certainly gave a sense that foraging mushrooms was not something that was uncommon to her and was a habit that had sort of started developing as early as 2020. She was also asked by her barrister about death cap mushrooms, and the court had previously seen some material that indicated internet searches for death cap mushrooms around South Gippsland. And Erin Patterson said she basically looked up to see if they grew around her in her area. She felt fairly satisfied they didn't, and that was about it. And she's also said, in her evidence, but also the defence said in their opening, that she never knowingly foraged for death cap mushrooms.
So eventually, after more evidence, Erin Patterson's barrister takes her directly to the day of the lunch in question, the beef Wellington meal that we've all come to hear about. What did she say when her barrister asked her outright about the poisonous mushrooms? Yeah,
so Colin Mandy, I suppose you could maybe say, was quite gentle with her, but also quite exacting. He was trying to take her through in very careful detail everything that had occurred in the lunch, and making sure that if there was something he felt that perhaps wasn't clear to the jury, that he was asking that question again, or slightly changing the way he asked that. Eventually he said to her, "Look, do you accept there must have been death cap mushrooms in there?" And she answered, "Yes, I do." And that's not really been in dispute here, but it was still something that was quite, I suppose, arresting to sort of hear her say that, yes, in her own words, "Yes, I accept that's what killed these lunch guests." Of course, she doesn't accept she deliberately put them in there, but hearing her say that was quite extraordinary. And she was then sort of taken through, well, if you accept that now, what about all the people you told after the lunch about where those mushrooms came from? Now, we've heard right back at the very start of this that Erin Patterson told, health officials, family members, police, that they were mushrooms from Woolworths and mushrooms from an Asian grocer. What sort of emerged, I suppose, as she was on the stand being questioned by her lawyer, Colin Mandy, was that Erin Patterson had a container of dried mushrooms she bought from an Asian grocer that she took out of the packet. They smelled a bit funny. She put them in a Tupperware container, put them in her pantry at a property she owns in Melbourne. She cleaned out that property, took that container of mushrooms, put it in her house in Leongatha where she hosted the lunch. There was another container of dried mushrooms in there that were foraged mushrooms. Erin Patterson said effectively there were these two different Tupperwares of dried mushrooms. There was the dried mushrooms she bought from an Asian grocer in Melbourne, and there was a container of dried mushrooms that she had foraged, and they were both in the pantry at her home in Leongatha.
So once her barrister establishes Erin Patterson accepts there were death cap mushrooms in the meal she cooked, and the evidence that you've just described to us, he takes her through in detail, step by step, the process that she took of preparing and cooking that meal.
Yeah, that's right. So effectively, Erin Patterson talks about inviting Gail and Heather to the lunch. That invite happened almost a couple of weeks earlier at church. They were very happy to go. Erin Patterson says she'd hosted Gail and Don a couple of weeks before that and was really keen to do something else. So she came across this special recipe in the Recipe Tin Eats cookbook for beef Wellington. She said that recipe called for like a large log of steak, so a single large piece of steak, but that she had a little bit of trouble sourcing that, so decided to buy individual eye fillet steaks. And once she did that, because instead of making one large beef Wellington, she was going to be making individual ones, she said that she knew she'd have to sort of deviate from the recipe a little and buy more pastry and also buy more mushrooms, effectively, because instead of having, one large one, you're going to do 6 individual ones is what she was now planning on doing. So she goes through the process of buying these ingredients. She says that she quite often went to the supermarket, so she was a bit unclear about when she would have bought the actual ingredients that she used for all of these, but we've seen her Woolworths Everyday Rewards history amongst the many pieces of evidence in this case, and that sort of showed that she'd purchased these mushrooms and these steaks in the days leading up to it. So anyway, Erin Patterson then starts telling the jury about the process of actually cooking this meal. And it starts the day before, she says, when she sort of salts the steaks to try and get them ready to go. The morning of the lunch is when she starts cooking down the mushrooms. She says she did that for about 45 minutes. The whole idea of this was to get all the moisture out so that the pastry wouldn't be soggy when you actually construct the beef Wellington. But she said after she tried the mushroom mix, it was a little bit bland. And so she basically reached into her pantry, grabbed a Tupperware container of dried mushrooms, sort of rehydrated them using water, chopped them up, and put them in with everything else to try and give that more flavour. And at the time, she said she believed she was using the mushrooms that she got from that Asian grocer in Melbourne. But as she was sort of gradually taken through this by her lawyer, Colin Mandy, in court, she said that now she believes there was a possibility there were foraged ones in there as well.
So Patterson's barrister then takes her through the process of plating up the meal in great detail, whether she remembered the plate she had, what her lunch guests did, and then the evidence turns to what happened after the lunch.
Yeah, he did. And, Erin Patterson even went as far as saying, I didn't have 4 grey plates, the plates that the prosecution say she served up her lunch guests, the poisoned beef Wellingtons, while keeping a separate one for herself that wasn't poisoned. So we went through that level of detail as well. But then Erin sort of said that after her guests left, that she was feeling overly full. She told her lawyer that she'd eaten quite a lot of cake. She also said earlier on in her evidence that she had a history of I suppose a relationship with food that was unhealthy, and a history of binge eating, and the words I think she used, which she used to eat everything that she could get her hands on. She felt quite sick after this lunch, and when everyone had left, she said she went to the toilet and brought it all back up again. And, we obviously know that the rest of Erin Patterson's lunch guests get quite unwell from this point on later that night. Erin Patterson herself says that night she was also unwell. She had abdominal pain and diarrhea, that the symptoms sort of subsided a little bit by the following day, but by July 31, so 2 days later, she felt that she hadn't really retained any fluid, and so decided after she dropped her kids at school that she'd take herself to hospital. And she also sort of said that she'd fed some of those leftovers of the lunch of the beef Wellington to her children after taking away the mushrooms and the pastry, particularly because they didn't like mushrooms.
So we'll leave the lunch at that point and just have a look at her relationship with her now deceased in-laws, because that has really been a part of the evidence as well. Can you tell us a bit about what we heard about how she felt about her lunch guests and what kind of relationship she had?
Yeah, so a huge part of the evidence in this case has been text message exchanges between Erin Patterson and her in-laws, but also, Facebook group chats between Patterson and her friends. And sometimes these things were going on at the same time. She was having message exchanges with her family on the one hand, and then she was talking to her Facebook friends on the other. And there was a tension that developed in how she was speaking to her family and how she was speaking to her friends about her family. But, Erin was taken through those messages in quite fine detail while she was in the witness box. She said that, some of those things she wished she hadn't said. Some of the things she said to her Facebook friends she wished she hadn't said. One of the messages was, "This family, I swear to fucking God." And, she says, "Look, I was hurt, I was frustrated, but I really wish that I hadn't said that now." And, she said she wished the family didn't have to hear that as well. And I suppose she kind of said that, look, I loved them. I always loved them. The reason I wanted to have the lunch was because I wanted to maintain a healthy relationship with these people, even though Simon and I weren't sort of relating that well at that particular point in time. But at the same time as she was trying to do that, she did also find it frustrating some of the ways that they weren't getting involved necessarily in resolving some of the problems that she hoped Don and Gail would mediate between her and Simon. So, she said that, yes, she used that group to vent. Other members of that group vented similarly about their in-laws, and that basically, she was saying things in there she wished she hadn't. And, it wasn't just, I guess, her relationship with Simon's parents that was sort of brought up and explored, but also her children's relationship with their grandparents. And, Patterson was asked about her son's relationship with Don particularly, and basically said, look, they were like two minds separated by 50 years. And she says her son, just loved him. And that was quite emotional testimony when she gave that.
Nino, let's go back to that lunch because Erin Patterson's barrister and later the prosecution goes through some conversations she had about the subject of cancer with her lunch guests, and there's some disputed evidence there.
So there's, I suppose, two particular kind of strands to this that Erin Patterson was taken to during her evidence. There's the messages she exchanged with Gail Patterson about a lump in her elbow. Erin Patterson basically admitted that she told a series of lies in those messages. She said she did have pain in her elbow, that Don and Gail were really kind to her and cared for her when that happened. The pain then subsided, but because they'd been so nice to her about it, she kind of kept that lie going, was the effect of her evidence, and led them to sort of believe that it might be a bigger issue than it was, and that, she needed a needle biopsy and things like that, which she admitted she didn't actually need. And then there was a sort of, I suppose, a separate strand of the evidence which sort of went to what the lunch guests themselves were told was the reason for them coming to Erin's place, and also what she told them once they were there. And Erin Patterson's evidence about this sort of took on, I suppose, again, a few different strands or a few different avenues. There was, one of them was that she had a pre-appointment booked for some gastric banding surgery. She had been speaking a lot about problems she had with her weight and her self-image, and she felt that she was going to get something done about that. That was coming up in September, and she hoped that this sort of, I guess, flagging that she had a health issue that was serious and that might require surgery would mean that she could get Don and Gail to help with the logistical side of looking after her kids. But on the other hand, she was embarrassed about mentioning the reason for that surgery. She didn't want them to know that she was doing this because of her weight. And so she said basically she may have led them to believe that cancer was the reason why she might be needing some help coming up, and the reason for tests she was getting, an appointment she was having, and things like that. But, she did also stress that, look, my family's had a history of ovarian cancer. I have in the past been worried about having ovarian cancer, that, there was some elements of truth to it, in the sense that I had concerns at various stages that might be something that I was going through. But no, I'd never had cancer. No, I'd never been diagnosed with cancer. But she was also really wanting to make clear that she did not tell the guests at her lunch that she had cancer. Now, the main evidence for the prosecution about that is coming from Ian Wilkinson, who was at the lunch, survived, and gave evidence early on in this trial that Erin did tell him that she had cancer. His evidence was that it was a fairly unambiguous conversation, that afterwards they actually said a prayer for Erin. And the other piece of evidence that the prosecution sort of relies on about this, what they call the cancer lie, is something that Simon Patterson said his father told him about the lunch. So his father was in hospital. Simon spoke to him there, and Simon says Don Patterson told him that Erin would be getting chemotherapy and possibly having surgery for this cancer. So there's, I suppose, a bit of a gap there in the evidence that we've heard so far in this trial about what exactly happened at that lunch and what Erin Patterson told her guests about cancer or otherwise.
Well, in fact, you've set out some of the discrepancies in that evidence between different parties, and that's what came out into focus in cross-examination. That's sort of started with prosecutor Nanette Rogers, SC, interrogating Patterson over some of the details in her evidence.
Yeah, that's right. So Rogers asked her fairly point blank, I suggest to you told your lunch guests that you received a cancer diagnosis. Agree or disagree? Patterson disagreed. And then she suggested to her that she'd lied about that cancer to her guests as, quote, you thought the lunch guests would die and your lie would never be found out. And Patterson responded, quote, that's not true. So she fairly squarely put that to her, that, the evidence that the trial has already heard suggests this, and Erin Patterson obviously refutes that that's what actually happened.
Let's come to another part of the evidence that has been covered heavily, and that's the dehydrator. It's something we've heard about repeatedly during this trial. And one of the questions around it is why Erin Patterson disposed of that dehydrator that she used to prepare the meal. She actually disposed of it at a tip and then lied about owning it to the police.
Yes, that Sunbeam dehydrator is what the prosecution say Erin Patterson used to dry death cup mushrooms that she had foraged before she added them in to those beef Wellingtons. She says that, I suppose, the sort of origin of that was her fear of child protection becoming involved after the lunch. She was in hospital. There was a conversation she had with Simon about a blind taste test involving dried mushrooms she'd put in muffins for her kids, and her daughter actually liked the muffins that had the most dried mushroom in it. And she says that Simon asked her, is that how you poisoned my parents, using that dehydrator? Which, Erin sort of responded, and her evidence was quite emotional at this point, that, she said, of course not. But for her, according to her evidence, that was the moment where she thought, I've got to get rid of this thing. Child protection are coming to visit my house tomorrow. They're going to see that. They're going to link that to what's happened with the lunch. I've got to go dump it. And, the court's been shown footage of her driving to the local tip and throwing it in the e-waste bin. And, it's also heard that police later found that with her fingerprints on it and traces of death cap mushroom in it. But effectively, Erin Patterson says that conversation in the hospital started this, I suppose, also almost a chain of panic and a chain of concern and worry about what that dehydrator could mean, not just for a potential police investigation, but around the possibility of actually losing her children.
And what was interesting is that the dehydrator becomes the subject of cross-examination as well, when the prosecutor goes over that lie to police. Tell us what happened with that.
It was how the prosecution actually started their cross-examination, with almost this kind of, staccato sort of, was that a lie, was that a lie, was that a lie, about the dehydrator, and Erin Patterson admitted, 3 times in a row, yes, it was a lie that she told about the dehydrator. She went through the fact that, yes, she'd told people she'd never dehydrated mushrooms. She's even shown in her police interview, as was seen earlier in the trial, the manual for the actual dehydrator she's just thrown at the tip and said, oh, no, I don't know when I owned that. And I just keep lots of old manuals. So, the prosecution asked her about that piece of evidence as well. And, Patterson basically says, look, I agree I lied because I was afraid I'd be held responsible. And, the prosecution said, trying to, I suppose, draw out as much as they possibly could from Patterson about this, that I suggest you had been dehydrating death cap mushrooms on or after the date of purchase of that dehydrator for the purpose of putting them in the beef Wellingtons you serve to your lunch guests. And Patterson's response was, that's not correct. So they're very clearly trying to show that, I suppose, or suggest to the jury that the lies that they have been told Erin Patterson said about the dehydrator are not the only lies that Erin Patterson actually said in this case. That's the prosecution case, and that's what they're trying to draw out of her during their cross-examination.
And part of that was images of mushrooms on scales as well.
Yeah, that's right. So there were the trays of the dehydrator on scales with the actual weight in grams of those mushrooms, underneath and shown, and they were on photos that were taken from devices seized from Erin Patterson's house. And so, under cross-examination, she was asked effectively, well, what's going on here? Why have you got trays of mushrooms? A mushroom expert earlier on in the trial had said, with a high degree of certainty, those sliced mushrooms on those trays are death cap mushrooms. And, Erin Patterson was asked, were you in effect here weighing these mushrooms so you could calculate the fatal dose of death caps for a person, which she denied. According to prosecution, Erin Patterson visited a site nearby where death cap mushrooms had been discovered. The photo that she was then shown in cross-examination, they say, lines up with that time frame of Erin Patterson going to this local site where death cap mushrooms had been reported, picking those mushrooms, going home and slicing them up, putting them on the dehydrator scales, and then taking a photo of what those mushrooms weigh, the prosecution say, so that she could calculate a fatal dose for a human.
Nino, you've described some really gripping evidence, and it's such a heavily covered case. We're all going to continue to keep an eye on what's happening. But what has the jury been told they can expect from this point on? Yeah,
so Erin Patterson's evidence is likely to continue into next week. From that point on, the jury have been told that there might be a day without them, so a day of legal argument. There then might be even more evidence, brought up in the trial. There'll then be the sort of closing arguments. So the prosecution and defence will give their closing arguments. And then Justice Christopher Beale, the judge in the case, will give his directions to the jury. And that will include fairly specific instructions about how they can use the evidence they've heard over the preceding, 6 or 7 weeks. And then ultimately it's up to them. There's 14 members of the jury, and 12 of them will decide on the verdict, and it has to be unanimous. 12 have to decide whether Erin Patterson is guilty or not guilty.
Well, Nino, thank you so much for your reporting on this so far. You've been keeping us across this trial, and we're just going to have to wait and see what happens next. Thank you.
Thank you.